is amplified. At the same time, there is evidence that not only persons with disabilities, but really everyone could benefit if ICTs were designed inclusively. And so during this workshop, we'll be looking at a diverse set of stakeholders, including you as a participants, mainly from East Africa and Western Europe, and we'll be discussing two main aspects. The first is the state of the art of digital accessibility, and then we'll hear about systemic barriers to accessibility. But of course, our main objective here, and I'd like you to remember this, is to develop concrete recommendations for implementation of accessibility policies. And so in short, we're here to see how we can improve usability for communities who are currently, by and large, excluded from digital development. I'd like to take a moment now to thank the people who organized this session. It's been supported by the German Corporation for International Cooperation, or GIZ, and they're doing this on behalf of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, or BMZ, if you are in Germany. This, of course, would not be much of an inclusive session if we didn't do our best to include everyone. So I'm happy to announce that there's a live transcription available for this session. You can simply access it by pressing the closed caption tab on your device. It is available in various languages, so feel free to look at it at any one point. We'll also be taking questions and/or statements from you, our audience, later on in this program. And to participate, you simply send us a message on chat, or you can raise your hand on the chat, and our online moderator, Mr. Paul Hosters, will bring your contribution to my attention, and then we'll be able to share it with the rest of you. So I'd now like to introduce the esteemed panel who will be speaking at this workshop. We'll be hearing later from Irene Mbare Kireka. She is the executive producer at enable.org. Now, Enable is an NGO that empowers the blind and impaired visually students in Africa through computer assistive technology. And it's no wonder that she's recognized as a dynamic global strategic leader and an executive level innovator. Welcome, Irene. We'll also be hearing from Tim Unwin. He is the co-founder of Tech Together. That's an organization working together to change men's attitude about women and technology. Isn't that cool? He's also a UNESCO chairholder at ICT4D. Now, ICT4D is a group of researchers and practitioners who are committed to excellence in the use of ICTs for development. He's also a really great writer on the use of technology in development practices, and I'm sure we'll be hearing some of those quotes from him later when he speaks. Bernard Shearer is also joining us. He is the director of Africa First Assistive Technology and Accelerator Program at AMREF Enterprises in partnership with Global Disability and Innovation Hub, Innovative Now. Innovative Now is part of the project AT 2030. Lots of letters and numbers here, but it's a life-changing assistive technology for all, and I can't wait to hear from him. We'll also hear from Claire Sipthorpe. I really hope I've said your name right. She's the head of GSMA, which is focused on accelerating digital and financial inclusion for women and works with mobile operators and their partners to address the barriers to women accessing and using mobile internet and mobile money services. Now, she does have about 20 years under her belt with public, private, and international development organizations on social policy, service delivery with a focus on information and communications technology. We're also going to be hearing from Wairagala Wakabi. This is the executive director at CIPESA, I would believe, that's how you say it, an organization aimed at promoting effective and inclusive ICT policy in Africa. He holds a PhD in informatics with specialization in e-government, as well as an MSc in informatics. So as you can see, a really highly decorated panel, and we'll be digging into what their thoughts are on these very issues later. But it brings me great joy to introduce our first speaker and the person who will be giving us our opening remarks, Dr. Bernd Schramm. He's heading a global project on the inclusion of persons with disabilities at GIZ head office, commissioned by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Welcome, Dr. Schramm.
Thank you so much, Edith. Hello, dear participants and dear ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this virtual workshop at this year's Internet Governance Forum about universal design and digital inaccessibility. My name is Bernd Schramm. I'm the head of a global project on inclusion of persons with disabilities in German Development Cooperation. I'm particularly thankful for the Federal German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, short the BMZ, who has not only commissioned our project, but is also supporting this important workshop. It is a real pleasure to me to have the honor to welcome our great speakers and moderators today on behalf of BMZ. They spared no efforts to be with us today and share their extraordinary expertise and insights on this important subject. I also want to thank Paul Horsters from GIZ for taking the lead in conceptualizing this workshop and bringing together such a diverse group of competent speakers. What we are talking about today, we will be talking about an issue of increasing relevance and great scope, which has unfortunately been neglected for too long. The inclusion of persons with disabilities in the area of digital development. Persons with disabilities constitute more than 15% of the world's population and more than 1 billion people globally, of which 80% live in low and middle income countries. The German Development Corporation implements a human rights-based approach, is strongly targeted towards gender equality, and seeks to mainstream inclusion of persons with disabilities within its projects and programs. The strategy for digital development by BMZ, our federal ministry, entails equal opportunities as one of its 5 main pillars. Roughly 1 year ago, BMZ adopted a comprehensive cross-sectoral strategy for including persons with disabilities in our development efforts. Ensuring this in an increasing number of digital projects worldwide is fundamental and grows more fundamental day by day. The COVID-19 pandemic reveals clearly how situations of crisis affect the vulnerable the most, and why we need to work together for a future that leaves no one behind. Accessible applications, platforms, websites, but also digital literacy, digital skills, knowledge how to use assistive technologies, affordable soft and hardware, as well as connectivity and awareness about existing technologies and their benefits is essential for building this future. With regard to persons of disabilities, we are currently piloting and upscaling different approaches to inclusive IT. For instance, in Ghana, Morocco, and Kenya, both the so-called Digital Skills Accelerator Africa and the Bridge Academy in Kenya focus on IT skills and jobs for persons with disabilities. We support these projects together with valuable partners from the private sector, the government, and international NGOs specializing on disability rights. Why is it important to have persons with disabilities as coders, web and software developers of tomorrow? Because only if digital technologies are designed inclusively from the start, we make essential features of social life available for all. E-governance, e-education, e-commerce, e-health are just some of the many examples for this. There is sometimes a misunderstanding when talking about universal design in the context of disabilities. Universal design seeks to make products, services, and environments accessible for all, not just for persons with disabilities. In fact, the most diverse groups of users, including persons with disabilities, should participate in the design of these products and services. There is one thing people often forget to realize in this context. The challenges experienced by persons with disabilities and other groups can and do actually foster innovation, increase usability, widen the customer base, and ultimately benefit everyone. For example, voice output and input does not only benefit persons with disabilities, but illiterates and elderly persons as well. The invention of the email is another example. This would not have been possible without trying to overcome communication barriers through digital technologies for persons with hearing impairments. Let me stop here, dear ladies and gentlemen. Our great speakers know much more about this, and they know much more about it than I do. So I thank everybody of you for joining in today and look very much forward for this exciting workshop. Back to Edith. Thanks again to all of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schramm. I think we all felt like your speech ended a little bit too soon. I could have wanted to hear more from you, but an auspicious start indeed. And so it brings me great pleasure to ask you, members of our audience, based off of what Dr. Schramm has said, I'd like to ask you a question and poll it real quick. What do you think is the main challenge for the over 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide in using digital technologies from your point of view? I'll just repeat that question again. What's the main challenge for over 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide in using digital technologies from your point of view? Do you think that it's A, affordability? Is it B, connectivity? C, accessibility? D, awareness? E, skills? Or F, something that's not even on this list? I'll just go through those options again. Is it affordability? Is it connectivity, accessibility, awareness, skills, or something that's not even posed right here? I really look forward to your comments and your views on that. But to move along with the program, I'll definitely be sharing the results on that, don't you worry. But the first question I'd like to pose is to Irene Barry-Kerika, one of our esteemed panelists. And the question, you should have a pop-up on your screens right now to basically let you choose what you think the answer is, and you can submit. I've just made my submission. All right, so back to Mrs. Kerika. First of all, what do you think? I'm asking you to do something impossible here, to anticipate what you think our participants will say. And then I'll give you the real answer and we can go with your views on that.
Oh, thank you, Edith. I think, and because I work in this space, I think accessibility is one of the biggest challenges.
All right, short and sweet, to the point. Poll hostess, what do our participants think? Can you please bring us the poll results?
I can't see them right now. I think there are people saying that C and E are the main barriers, and that is C and E, that is accessibility and skills. That's what's being said here right now. Another participant is telling that accessibility covers the other options as well. I don't know whether Irene would agree with that, but yeah, go ahead, please.
So,
okay.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Irene, for interrupting, but it would seem that from right at this moment, Tim is suggesting that the poll needs to be closed and then it will show up. But going with this theory that accessibility encompasses all, what are your views on that?
So actually, I'm glad to hear accessibility and skills were some of the top comments, because I'm actually in both accessibility and skills training. So, and I completely agree, because if products are not accessible, if you don't focus on inclusive design from the onset of developing products, if you don't understand what people with disabilities need, you cannot design for them. So you cannot have an accessible product. So at the same time, people with disabilities need digital skills. Enable, which is the organization that I represent, has spent the last 13 years training blind students how to use technology. So we do have kids who do basic computer skills all the way to coding. But the point is, unless you teach them the basic skills, how to operate devices, how to use the technology, and how to access products, then they'll not be able to move to the next level. So at the same time, for them to access that information, the products that you're providing have to be fully accessible.
Okay, Irene, I'm just going to come back to you with a follow-up question because we are talking also about universal design. Oh, hold on one second. I've been interrupted by the poll results and the numbers are in. It looks like accessibility by a wide margin. That's what people think is the biggest challenge to people with disabilities worldwide using digital technologies. 57% of you think accessibility is a problem, followed very closely by affordability. 17% think that. And then awareness and other are sort of combined, and skills and connectivity somehow end up at the bottom. So Irene, coming back to you and the follow-up question, we are speaking about universal design, and the guy who coined this phrase, Ronald Mace, he said that it's the concept of designing all products and the built environment to be aesthetically usable and also basically practically usable to the greatest extent possible by everyone, regardless of their age, ability, or status in life. So where are we missing the mark? Is the design excluding persons with disabilities, or is it just not universal?
I think we're missing the mark in the first place from even recognizing that people with disabilities exist and they actually have specific needs. So even when we are going out to say we are developing products, when we gather our requirements for the group of people we want to design for, people with disabilities don't exist. But actually when we present the product and say it's inclusive to everyone. Until when people with disabilities try to use the product and they realize they cannot use the product. So the issue comes from requirements gathering to the design phase, to the development, testing, the whole process.
Okay, so this is a fantastic time to bring in Tim Unwin. Should we rather then seek to include persons with disabilities in the digital world, or should we seek to use digital tools to foster societal inclusion? What's the best approach here?
Hi, that wasn't the question I was expecting, Edith, but that's fine. There isn't a best approach. I think I would begin with. I think we need to design at the contextually specific level. Far too often people are interested in making a universal single solution that they will be able to market across the world. And actually, if you drill down, the needs of people in particular local contexts are really important. And that can apply at all different levels. I think it can apply in terms of the design of policies and strategies. You can have templates that can be adapted, but it also goes right down to the design of particular products. Here we have, we were talking before this session was set up, what sign language are we going to use? Because there are many different sign languages and attempts to universalize those. But just like I speak in English, mais nous pouvons parler en français si on peut faire. There's the dominance of the global. So I think listening to what Irene was saying, for me, probably the most important thing, it should never be designing for, but always designing with. And as I would pick up on her point that all too often people just don't see, and using that word wisely, people with disabilities, and they need to be involved in the process from the very, very beginning. And that's part of empowerment for people with disabilities.
I really like what you've just said, Tim, and I'm sorry that the question is not what you're expecting, but I have to say you handled it quite well. So Bernard, please expect perhaps a question you're not expecting either. In how far can universal design increase digital accessibility and stimulate innovation? By the way, we'll be coming back to some of these themes.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well. Thank you very much. So I think when you look at digital accessibility and universal design as enablers, then a lot of interesting things start to happen. And I'll give you very practical examples. One of the most fundamental issue around universal design is participation, that everyone can participate. And when you look at how our society is organized, a lot of the development, economic development, social development that every country is so aspiring to achieve. Look at the SDGs that we are all globally trying to drive together. This cannot be achieved if you leave any segment of society behind. And persons with disability, I'm glad, our minister from Germany talked about, we're talking about 15% of the total global population contributing to economic and social development. Think about that. Think about the number of people in Kenya or any other, low and middle income country that is not being given the opportunity to contribute to social and economic development. Now, let's see what happens when you introduce these concepts. All of a sudden, because of universal design, we can achieve accessible transportation or build infrastructure. People can move and go to work. And that's the simplest. That's the one that I've seen people try to address by putting ramps, but it's more than a ramp. It's more holistic than that. We have to think about accessibility more holistically. How accessible are our institutions, our banks, our schools? Am I able to achieve the same level, arrive at a meeting, the same time, and not have to wake up 5 hours earlier to get to the same meeting? Because if I go during a peak time during traffic, I basically won't be able to access, and that's happening in many parts of the world, including right here in Kenya. I'll give you other possibilities. All of a sudden, you will see children who, for many reasons, are not able to access education early enough because schools do not feel equipped to train children with disabilities. And I think Irene is working in this sector trying to bring digital skills to children who have visual impairment. All of a sudden, these kids become, from a very young age, nurtured to become contributors. And last but not least, we talk about wanting to achieve sustainable impact in many facets of life. When you look at our society, when you look at our environment, all these issues can actually we can learn from inclusive design and use the same principles to make the world a better place. It is not about persons with disability. It is about human beings being able to thrive on this planet. And it's not a favor. We are not asking special treatment for persons with disability. All we're trying to ask for is, can we build a world where everyone can participate regardless of their age, disability, and any other characteristics that makes us unique. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernard. I think that was a really strong point you made. Holistic universal design. And I like the examples you gave about having to plan 2 hours before getting to work because it's simply just not accessible. And it sounds like a very rudimental thing, but can you maybe take us back to some of the specific challenges that people with disabilities in low and middle income countries like this one we're living in with regard to ICT usage face?
Thank you very much. So when I look at the future of education and even the current trends in education, and I choose education because I believe it is so fundamental in creating a sustainable future for our kids. Technology is deeply embedded. We are not escaping from this. And we cannot claim to be an advanced society if the most vulnerable people in our society cannot access the same level of user experience as anyone else. So in Kenya, we are now being faced with the COVID-19 pandemic. These are very practical examples. All the schools are closed, and the new trend now is digital learning. Let's learn from home. Let's all join Zoom and have a great time, right? Now, when you look at kids who have disabilities, it is so sad because their problems are compounded. Parents are not equipped with how to give their kids access to digital learning. If you have a disability, your parent is trying to get around Zoom before they can even help you. And also we have a challenge of resource. Many homes are not equipped with the assistive technology and the digital tools that would enable kids with disabilities to learn while they're at home. And this, we don't know how long COVID is going to last, but it's teaching us fundamental lessons about inclusion. Because if I'm able to learn from home, why shouldn't a kid who is blind or deaf be able to access their class from home? And our education ministries and our governments needs to be empowered to not to look at disability inclusion from a lens of, this is not, a special thing we have to think after we've sorted out everyone else. This is something we have to sort out from day one. Our schools need to be equipped with the technologies and resource people to help our kids learn. And that is just education. I have not talked about access to work, where we also need inclusive employment and jobs. Our current cohort, we run cohorts of support for assistive technology entrepreneurs. And we just launched a call for innovators who are providing inclusive solutions for employment, and the role of assistive technology in that space is tremendous. And these are some of the practical examples, and I believe that from COVID, we are all learning one or two things on how to become better human beings.
I sure hope so, Bernard. I sure hope so. So Claire, we have heard from Bernard there that some of the key challenges, particularly in low and middle income countries, are access, digital illiteracy or literacy, resources being far too expensive. But even if you have all of these things, there's a question of this design. And from the perspective of the private sector, Claire, I'd like to know, what are the main reasons to disregard disability inclusion in the development of digital products and services? I mean, in how far is the private sector in charge really to increase digital accessibility, and how can it be done?
Thanks for the question. So I agree. I mean, the private sector needs to do more, but I also would argue all stakeholders need to do more. Unfortunately, I think this is being not considered sufficiently by all stakeholders, this issue. And as I think Bernard mentioned, it's sort of considered a bit of an add-on or afterthought, and that's absolutely not the way it should be considered. In terms of universal design, I think if there's a perception that adding this or considering this as an add-on is extra costs and it's difficult, but I think universal design is good design, and if you design your product with everybody in mind from the start, then there's it benefits everybody, and that needs to be the way it's done. We are about to release a set of principles for digital inclusion for people with disabilities on December 3rd, which has been designed by and for the mobile industry, and mobile being a key tool. So that's the tool that most people have in their hands. Smartphones have a lot of accessibility features in there. There's a huge potential. And we set out 3 kind of main areas that we think need to be tackled if we're going to do this. So 1, you need to embrace disability inclusion at every level of the organization. And when we launch this, we will have a series of practical things that people can do under each of these. But basically, you need to embrace disability inclusion. You really need to understand how and better to reach persons with disabilities, to really understand the challenges and needs. And we for example, run workshops with our members around looking at the customer journey and understanding what are the needs and requirements of persons with disabilities at every step in that kind of journey to accessing and using products. So without that data and understanding, then it's possible design. And then you need to really focus on delivering those inclusive products to meet the diverse needs and requirements of persons with disabilities. So I think what we're seeing is there's a lot more action by the private sector, certainly within our members, where more initiatives, more needs to be done for sure, but there's definitely a greater awareness and people are much more mindful. For example, Safaricom has been doing a lot of work in this space. And they've developed, for example, a voice platform to enable visually impaired customers to call a number to connect to their mobile money service. People in Bangladesh, for example, Grameen Phone has incorporated sign language-based digital service and an app. So we're seeing more, but more certainly needs to be done. And I think another space where there's more work is needed is around in the innovation space. We see that there's a lot, we've identified through our research, a lack of early stage funding for startups and social enterprises trying to develop digital assistive products and with inclusive design. So we've also just launched to try and tackle this, a new innovation fund for assistive technologies that will support financially and with technical assistance ventures in this space. So I think that's another important area. And when we look at our research, just kind of point on the question that was raised in the Zoom. So we do a lot of research also on this topic to try and fill this gap, because there is a big gap in terms of the data available. And when we did, so we've done big surveys and big pieces of research in lots of low and middle income countries. And we see that there is definitely, first of all, a disability gap in access and use of mobile, which means that even if you have inclusive designed products and service, they're not reaching everybody. So we need to address this gap. And when we look at what are the barriers to people using mobile services, people with disabilities, the top barriers that are coming out are things like affordability of handsets and literacy and skills and awareness of accessibility features. So we did some research, for example, in Kenya and Bangladesh, and only 10% of mobile owners use accessibility features in those countries. There's a huge lack of awareness. We in fact just published a training content that could be used by any organization just to increase awareness for people with visual and hearing disabilities about how to use the accessibility features, because even when these are there and things are accessible, there's a lack of awareness that they're there and how to use them. So there's just I think it's a big issue. There's a holistic issue that needs to be thought about from both the access to the devices, affordability of those devices, accessibility and design of the services. It needs to be considered holistically if we're really going to tackle this incredibly important challenge and a huge opportunity for everybody, not just people with disabilities, but for the private sector. It's a massive market opportunity and segment if you think about the number of people with disabilities in the world and the critical importance of ensuring that they're included. And as Bernard said right from the beginning, this needs to be thought of from the start of the design process and consideration of products and services.
Thank you so much, Claire. And just to borrow your words, universal design is good design. But of course, as you've said, the private sector is getting better, but a lot still needs to be done. So Weragala Wakabi, what's the main challenge with regard to insufficient implementation of accessibility, particularly from a policy point of view?
Thank you. I would say that the challenges for the government are a bit different from those of the private sector. For the most part, I think governments are either indifferent or clueless or both about what they need to be doing in order to meaningfully improve accessibility. We find that there are no champions for most governments I'm familiar with. There are no champions for accessibility. But there is also limited advocacy that comes from the non-government sector that is holding governments to account in order to support accessibility more robustly. So the manifestations, obviously, of the lack of government efforts in this regard include the poor implementation of laws and policies. Very many governments have laws and policies that really aim to improve accessibility, but they are hardly implemented. There are policies on access to information, on education, on right to political participation, all of which have very good aspirations among the different countries, but we find that hardly anything is done, partly because, like I said, government either appear indifferent or clueless, but also there is little that is being done in way of holding them to account to show how have you lived up to what we expect of you as a government that should be doing. Governments, for instance, have in many countries, they have inaccessible websites, inaccessible e-services, even where national authorities in countries like Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria have come up with guidelines that all government entities, ministries, departments, and agencies are supposed to follow. But there is nobody that is being held to account when they do not honor those obligations. Bernard Shearer just mentioned the issue of access to education services in the COVID era. It's also true for work, like he said, but it's also true for political participation. Very many countries right now are going through electoral processes, but there are also social distancing protocols that have to be followed. That means that a lot of the campaigning, a lot of the citizen education, how leaders are engaging with how candidates are engaging with the electorate is through digital means. But in as much as countries may have access to information laws that provide for accessibility, for information be released in friendly formats, we find that there is very little that is being done in terms of providing that information in friendly formats, which obviously undermines the right to participation for persons with disabilities. The other issue, again, which shows is both a manifestation of the problem, but also becomes a problem itself, is the lack of disaggregated data. I think Claire has hinted on this. Just like the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, Goal 17 of the SDGs stresses the need for countries to provide high quality, timely, and reliable data that is disaggregated by disability. In our region here, there's also the African Protocol on the rights of persons with disabilities, which was passed just 2 years ago. It also asks countries to ensure collection and analysis of national statistics and data that cover disabilities in order to be able to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. But when you look at our countries, I do not know any country that consistently collects data on how many people with disabilities are there, what are their needs, what categories are using ICTs, and how they are not. A few countries like Kenya, I think a year or two ago, like Uganda a year or two ago, have done one-off studies to try and understand the needs of disabilities regarding ICT access. But these are one-off efforts, and they're not what is envisaged in the CRDP or SDGs or in the aforementioned African Protocol. The similar thing is with the expensive assistive technologies. Again, we see that governments are not doing anything about this. They should, and they have the means to do it. But also, private sector isn't doing anything substantial about it. Why? Again, it goes to the lack of sufficient goodwill, the lack of holding government to account, the lack of governments and regulators themselves also holding private sector players to be accountable and fulfill their obligations. Governments, of course, can offer incentives for investment and innovation in accessible devices and software to encourage their development. But also private sector, of course, this could be done, for instance, through tax incentives, or tax exemptions on mobile devices, for instance, or through the usage of universal service funds. Very many countries have universal service funds, which are invested in not very fruitful ways, which are not invested very sustainably, which do not always go to meeting the mandate of enabling the people who are marginalized, who are unserved, to get access. Many governments also have tech innovation funds that are often given out to mostly through competitive processes. Again, a chunk of this could go to supporting accessibility. My last point on this is with the private sector. I think that the social and business case for accessibility design and innovation is not patently clear to many of the private sector actors. That means that they have not addressed accessibility issues sufficiently, but also in a situation where governments are not enforcing laws and policies on this. And civil society also is not really speaking out forcefully and loudly to make the case for private sector to fulfill their obligations. We have seen very little in way of the private sector itself coming on the table proactively and robustly working to improve accessibility.
Well, what an opening you started with, Mr. Wakabi, saying that governments are completely clueless. So then I have to go back to Tim, because I don't want to leave us feeling so desolate and hopeless. How then can, in the absence of government and lackluster at best participation from the private sector, how can we support digital inclusion through international and development cooperation?
Thanks very much, Edith. And I've put up on the screen here, hopefully you can all see it, some of the answers as to ways through which we might be able to address that a little bit more. And it goes back to Bernd's comment. And I just will summarize with 3 basic points. The first, I think particularly international agencies and organizations, but also entities such as GIZ and our own FCDO here in the UK, we can share good practices. And I come back, there are no best practices. Anyone who says the word best practice is trying to impose their views on you. So good practices draw examples from elsewhere, and you design into your local context. And I think there is a key role, going back to what was just said about international agencies and donors helping governments to deliver just what was articulated so very, very clearly just before me. So sharing good practices, not imposing a single universal practice. Having guidelines and templates, as Claire was talking about, you can then adapt in your local context is really important. And I think, Waranga, I'd written this before you said what you said. So I think the second point I make here is how we can support governments to turn policy rhetoric into practical actions. I mean, in recent years, I've been working with and in Islamic countries, and we did a survey of 5 Islamic countries, all of which had very, very different levels of policy application implementation for persons with disabilities. And I think if we had to encapsulate these, and they included places like Jordan, Tunisia, Qatar, Pakistan, and Malaysia, a range of different countries. But going back to the previous point, governments, even if they have the will, may not know how best to apply those policies. And unfortunately, invariably, policies are designed and written up by consultants and experts from outside who are paid huge amounts of money, and they finish up on the shelves. So actually, if donors and multilateral organizations should, having maybe supported those policies being crafted, then actually engage practically on the ground in their implementation. And I think the third point I'd make very briefly, and Claire, we could perhaps have a discussion and a debate about this, but I think a real challenge with the digital tech sector at the moment is too much funding that's being spent on innovation. Innovation has become a buzzword. If you're an entrepreneur or any kind of innovator, you know perfectly well that 90% of your innovations fail, and you're looking for just one that works. So I think it's actually immoral for donors to fund too much on innovation because they're funding failure. So, and we know, going back to Bernard's point about education, we know how to deliver education with and for the most marginalized. We've known it for years, but we're not doing it. We know how to roll out tech with persons with disabilities in vocational training. We know how to do it. GIZ has done some outstanding work in this field, but we're not doing it. Why are we not doing it? And that's the interesting question. I think because we have a fetish around innovation, science is going to solve the world's problems. These aren't scientific, these aren't technical problems that Waranga was just speaking about. It's not having the will, and that's what we need to have. So I would just go back and summarize those 3 points again. Firstly, as you can see them here, firstly, sharing good practices. Secondly, supporting governments to turn policy rhetoric into practical actions on the ground. And then thirdly here, funding things we already know make a difference. I actually think, Claire, and come back and I'd love the debate, but if governments and donors spent more money funding actually what we really know works, we would make a huge leap forward and let the private sector get on with doing the innovation and taking those risks. So thanks ever so much for coming back to me, Edith. I really appreciate that. And I hope I may have stirred up a little bit of debate as well.
Absolutely, you have, and you've actually preempted the question that I had for the audience, but perhaps I would rephrase it. You know, the original question was, if there's one thing you could change about accessibility of digital technologies, what would it be? But Tim has just given us a breakdown of what we can do because of what's not happening. So rather, do you think there's anything else you could add to that? Anything that Tim hasn't mentioned that you would change or you could change about accessibility of digital technologies? Please let us know. And as we wait for that response, I'd like to come back to Claire, because as you were speaking, Irene, who's actually on the panel, asked a very valid question, which was, what does tech investments in education for students with disabilities look like? And I think she was asking from the perspective of private sector.
Yeah, so I'll respond kind of more generally around also to sort of Tim's point. So absolutely, like we fundamentally believe that it needs to be that there's a lot that can be done without necessarily investment in innovation. You know, there's huge, there's fundamental building blocks that can be addressed and tackled by the private sector. But we also do think that there is a role to sort of fund innovators, because especially if you look in the mobile space, this is a new space, where the kind of access to smartphones is getting out in a way at a sort of rate that's higher than has ever been before. There's a lot of new it's a new area, so I think it's unlike other sectors where maybe it's more mature, where there's less need for investment in innovation. We did some landscaping research where we looked at, is there much innovation? And there was surprisingly little innovators kind of doing work around to tackling the barriers to digital inclusion for people with disabilities. And when we looked at why that was the case, there was a lack of that funding. So I think in a kind of newer area, I think there is a role for investment in innovation. That does absolutely not mean that we shouldn't be focusing on the building blocks, and that should be a very core focus, and that's a lot of the work. That's the work we do with our members. But I think there is a role for that investment. And yes, innovations fail, but we should learn from these failures too. And I don't think that means we shouldn't invest in trying to tackle these issues. These are issues that need to be tackled, and we need to invest in a range of ways, including looking at how we can support innovation, as well as kind of getting some of the fundamental building blocks down. So I think that's is a space for everything. And I think specifically in the kind of looking at digital inclusion with using mobile, we're at a sort of interesting point where we have that access now, and we're not seeing some innovations, but we think we can. And we've just, as I say, announced an innovation fund, and we've got a lot of applications, and some really interesting stuff we haven't seen before is coming through. So I do think there's a space, but I agree that it is not the answer, but there is a space for that. So I don't know if I've entirely answered the question I was asked, but that was the point I wanted to make.
I think Irene is best placed to respond to you, and she might be able to do it privately on the chat. But I'd like to invite all of our participants, all 43 of you, to please ask any questions that you might have. We've now opened the floor to you to send any questions or statements you might have that you would like shared at this panel. But before we get to that, or as you're sending those questions, I'd like to come to, I'm not sure if Bernard or Irene is best placed to answer this. Tim has just said that we should get away from using this word best practice. It's just an imposition. So what's the best way to measure the efficacy of digital accessibility? Irene, do you want to take that?
I think Bernard, you should take that. Let me give it to Bernard. Okay, Bernard.
Yeah. So you asked the best way to measure. And, while I agree, I come from the innovation practice. So before I respond to this, I will say to Tim that what we need is not less investment in innovation, is a balanced investment in all the facets that we know, are needed. But just coming back to your question, I think measuring cannot happen if we don't have metrics. So we need benchmarks, and we need to identify, okay, for example, if it's in the education sector in a country, how do we, first of all, what goals do we have for accessibility? Because those gives us benchmarks, and then we set metrics around those benchmarks that can help us understand whether we're moving in the right direction or whether we're actually missing the point. For example, a good goal could be, we'd love to have, say, 20% increase in number of persons with disability getting into professions that are digital or technology oriented. And if we have that as a goal, we can then go and look at our education system and courses that are offered to everyone to become professionals in this area, and then ask ourselves, how do we measure the number of persons with disabilities being able to access training, and how do we monitor that? So the thing is, my challenge with a lot of the approaches is that we do not seem to have clear goals, and we do not seem to have clear metrics around how we are going to measure whether we are achieving those goals. I think we can learn from the SDGs. They are ambitious goals, and they provide everyone with an overarching direction. But I think we have a responsibility as countries, as governments, to set our own benchmarks or goals around accessibility, and not just in education. We have to do this in a holistic manner across society. We have to look at the built environment. We have to look at education. We have to look at employment. We have to look at contribution and participation of persons with disability, even in leadership, and define clear goals and say, what will we achieve in the next 5 years, and how will we measure that? How will we report that? And how will we practically demonstrate that we have either achieved or not achieved those goals? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. There's already somebody with a response saying, their argument, and it's their opinion that the SDGs have failed. So setting goals, his point is, doesn't really make sense, but I'll give you a chance to respond to that later. I'd like to ask Irene. Cliff Mutegeki asks, what are some of the digital tools for persons with disabilities? And as you're thinking about that, I'd like Tim to also take on one question. It's a comment from Peter Crosby. And he says, for the most part, we're continuing to understand accessibility in terms of physical and sensory disabilities. As such, we're ignoring one of, if not the largest disabled populations, which is those of us with cognitive disabilities, for whom we have to understand ICT accessibility very differently. So my question to you is a word that Bernard has used. What is our responsibility when we talk about inclusion? But Irene, first to you, some of the digital tools available.
So there are various digital tools available for people with disabilities. But one thing I want to say first is some people with disabilities use specific tools, but also if you have your product fully accessible following the global accessibility guidelines, you will make your product accessible to more than just people with disabilities. People with low literacy levels will be able to access your content. And as we know, we have huge numbers of people with low literacy levels. People in low bandwidth areas will be able to access your information. We know Africa currently, most of it has very low bandwidth areas. And also the elderly will benefit from your digital products and services if they're actually accessible. So when you invest in accessibility, you're actually going to benefit everyone. When you design for people with disabilities, you design for everyone. So some of the tools I would talk about are like screen readers. For people who are blind or low vision, blind people use screen readers. And what happens is that the screen reader reads the content. Most people don't understand how does a blind person even get on a website. But what happens is that a screen reader reads the content on the website. And that's how they operate the device, they operate different applications and even access content. So if your website or application is not accessible, then the screen reader will not be able to read the content. A good example, during this COVID season, a lot of people are using PDFs to communicate, to share a lot of information, to write reports and send them around. What's happening is that you find a lot of those PDFs are actually not accessible to screen readers. So to screen readers, sometimes a PDF is blank or it reads information in a very different way that that the information is not able to make sense to someone who's blind. We also have Zoom, what is it called? Screen magnifiers for those who are legally blind. They use screen magnifiers where they can magnify the content up to 400%. That way they're able to see the letters and the content the way they should see it. We also have, for people who are deaf, they use captions. And if you think about captions, and that's why I'm also insisting that when you design for people with disabilities, you design for everyone. Captions were invented for people with disabilities. But today, think about it. For people who are going to the gym, if you don't want to make noise for anyone, you put on your captions when you're watching something. For someone who's in a matatu or any public transportation or any public space, you're listening to a video or you're watching something, you turn on your captions. Think about Skype, think about Zoom right now. We're using captions. People can easily use captions if I don't want noise around me. So that tells you that if you make your digital products and services accessible for assistive technology to be able to be compatible, what ends up happening is you benefit everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. And I'd just like to reiterate that Claire mentioned, and she actually was so kind to post the link on the comment section, a tool or a link that can help with training. Claire, I hope I'm sending the right message here, that can help with usability of some of these tools. But Tim, I had asked you a question. I hope you're ready for me.
Yep, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the question. I think is that what is our responsibility? But I'd like to begin with can I just a short story at my expense. I was, as you can perhaps tell, I'm sort of kind of lively, and when I'm in a real live face-to-face gathering, I get up and walk about. And at last year's IGF, because I wanted to engage everyone in a round table, I got up and walked about. And afterwards, somebody quietly came up to me and was very cross with me because she said, I have autism and you were annoying doing that. And I couldn't concentrate. So even though I like to think that I'm quite, and I was deliberately, going up to people who were deaf. So I'd have some physicality there, and for blind people actually touching their desk, so they knew I was there. So I was trying very, very hard, but we'd still make mistakes. And yeah, I think part of the answer is we can never get it right, but our responsibility is to be aware. And then sort of two more positive things, I hope. One is, I go back to what so many colleagues around the table are saying already. Our responsibility must be inclusion for those with cognitive disabilities. I completely agree, they're often forgotten because they're invisible. I was actually going to use the invisible persons with disabilities as a comment earlier. So we need to be aware and do our best to be inclusive. And I think, going back to some of the things I think it was Bernard was saying around education, and I have a real challenge still over this debate between special education and mainstream education. Should we include all persons with disabilities in the same learning environment? Ideally, yes, but I know no education system in the world that is funded sufficiently well to do that. So for persons with cognitive disabilities, how should we be helping them learn? What's the best environment in which to do that? And I remain challenged by that. If there is enough resourcing in the education system, I think the mainstream is important, but in some contexts, and across the world, particularly in Africa, I've been to some amazing special schools that do an incredible amount of work to support people with cognitive disabilities. my main point in answer though is that what everyone's been reiterating, and Edith, you've been saying very powerfully, it's about inclusion. It's about a complete change of mindset. And yeah, it is all of our responsibilities. And we'll never get it right, but that doesn't mean we can't go on trying to be more inclusive in everything we do. Can I tell one other last story? I'll give 1 minute.
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
It's a physical disability one, but it links into this very nicely. Yeah, some people think the UK is a great country, and with Brexit coming up and the way we've mishandled COVID-19, I'm sure that's wrong. But I was another sort of, I had a son who had a Legg-Perthes disease. I don't know what whether that is, but disintegration of the hip. And when we were going to choose secondary schools for him, we went around and I asked him, what's your provision for persons with disabilities? And the teacher showing us around said, we don't have persons with disabilities. And I think in answer to your question there, cognitive disabilities, that is just so real. So thank you. I've spoken too long, Edith. I must shut up.
I mean, I really liked your points, very powerful insights there. Thank you for sharing. But now I'd like to invite back Paul Hosters, actually, because he is our online moderator, and I believe he has some questions from YouTube. And Irene says she'd like to make a comment, if time allows, on education for students in disabilities. So we'll have Paul first and then you, Irene.
Hello, everybody. Just maybe first we could take Daphne Stevens, because she said she would like to comment on that directly. Is it possible to unmute her from the side of the organizing team? I think she's currently in the watchers list. While we are waiting for that, we can continue with some questions that we received from YouTube. So there's one question from Sami Siongo Kibe. No, she's adding to another one. No, the first one was from Christina Suo. Are there training programs for the parents with disabled children? Learning usually starts at home. I think that would maybe go to maybe Irene or Tim, as those are mainly engaged with education. And then another question for the development cooperation sphere. What are the three main highlighting points about accessible features that development companies have to keep in mind? The three main highlighting points about accessible features. Okay, so those I think that might be enough for a start. And maybe we can head over now to Daphne Stevens. And if that's not possible, I would like Irene or Tim to answer the question. Thank you.
Okay.
Please go ahead, Irene.
Okay, great. So thank you for the question. So yes, there are programs for parents with disabilities, and let me talk about specifically Africa and not the first world. The challenge we face is that there are very, very limited resources for parents of children with disabilities. Enabled actually just completed a study courtesy of UK Aid, and we were trying to figure out what's going on with students with disabilities 3 months after COVID kicked in, when the government said that currently students are learning from home. And what we found is devastating. Kids with disabilities who are at home are not receiving any form of education. And if there's any education, it's on TV or radio, which is not accessible to if you're deaf or if you're blind, you're actually left out. So there's actually a big challenge in terms of parents are struggling a lot, and there's a lot of pressure. Students are struggling a lot because they're very idle and they're resulting to just doing household chores. And students are actually anxious to go back to school because they feel that's where they belong. So in terms of investments, there's limited investments. And the other comment I wanted to pass on education is that I think as donor agencies, as NGOs, as organizations, we have a habit of naturally focusing on trend. We bring programs based on trend. But one thing I want to say, COVID has created a lot of opportunities for disability, and it's important because disability has been brought to the forefront, And most importantly, people are realizing that the tech that we talk about all the time is not inclusive, whether it's in products and services, whether it's in education or anything. But the biggest mistake we are making, and we are going to continue making if we don't make a change, is when we don't invest in the future of education. What does that, I mean, of disability? What does that mean? If you're going to invest in disability, it doesn't start with just innovations and employment. It starts with education. We must make sure that our products have a full ecosystem where you start from education. What type of support are we providing for education in special schools? What are we providing in higher education? And then we get to employment, and then we get to products and services. What you're going to find today, everybody's focused on products and services and employment. Half the time, people are complaining people with disabilities don't have the skills they need to even be employed. So what I'm saying is, the students with disabilities who are in school today, 5 years from now, they'll be knocking on doors to either join employment or become entrepreneurs. So my point is, there's zero investment in tech. So we are talking technology, but special schools in Africa have zero technology. Enable has spent the last 13 years teaching blind kids how to use technology. These kids are innovative, they know what to do if you give them the skills and the technology they need. So I urge all donor agencies especially, this has been done in the first world. It has been successful. When we come to investing in disability in Africa, please let's start with education, because education, if you invest in education, you're investing in the future of disability in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. And Daphne, who we're trying to get in touch with, has just sent us a message. She says typing out might be easier. To respond to Tim, I don't know if you would like to read it out loud, Tim, as it's for you.
Yeah, I'm just reading it. And for those who may not be able to see, my little brother with Down syndrome has been lucky enough to go to a normal school with special support. This is definitely allowed to develop in such a way that might not have been possible if he went to special education. Now the whole town knows about him. He's very much included in society. So I had a positive note from the Netherlands. That says it all. I've got nothing to add. Daphne, thanks. But my comment would be that I think that just reinforces how great examples can be models and for spreading the word. And so it's working with people with disabilities, persons with disabilities, to help them become more visible, I guess, is part of going back to the invisible thing, enabling it to be normal. And well, what Bernd said at the beginning, and whether it's 10% of the world's population has some kind of disability or 20%, I mean, the middle of 15 is maybe about right. It depends, of course, how you define disability. I like to see it kind of this way, that we all have disabilities and we all have abilities. And we need, those of us who have fewer disabilities are incredibly privileged, but actually can benefit from tech less. It's those who have most disabilities are able to benefit from tech far more than those of us who have fewer disabilities. And we need to make everybody realize that. Edith, I think Claire's actually better than I am to answer the private sector question. I don't know if she heard about, but 3 main points about accessible features that the private sector should keep in mind. I could answer that, but Claire, you might prefer to.
Claire, it appears you've been volunteered to answer a question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what are the 3 main features? Well, I think it's sort of, I think it's hard to answer that question, because I think what we need to recognize is that there's such a diversity in terms of disability. So while one feature might be relevant for one segment of the population, others, so it's hard to, but I would just, I mean, again, what, we are as a program focusing on this because we see mobile as a key tool, especially smartphones. And I think our concern about the sort of lack of access to smartphones by people with disabilities, because it offers a range of technology, accessibility features and options to address the barriers. But I think it's hard to kind of say that there's, just a few things, features, because of as has been highlighted, that, there's a kind of visual impairment, hearing impairment, but also cognitive disability. So there's such a range, it's very hard to say that there's just 1 or 2 that would reach everybody. But I think it kind of comes back to the fundamentals of this session, which is that we actually need universal accessible design. We need to be thinking about everybody and what are the challenges that people can face. And if it can be accessible for as many people as possible, it'll benefit not just those with disabilities, but lower literacy or other challenges that they might be facing. So we just need to get back to that kind of core fundamental of a universal design approach.
Yeah, and before you leave, Claire, I'm just looking at the clock there. There was an earlier question from Band which ties in with what you're saying, and his question was, how can development cooperation, or what can development cooperation do to increase awareness of accessibility features?
Yeah, I shared in the chat. We've created because of this issue, and our research highlighting people just didn't know about the accessibility features. We've created a training toolkit. So I certainly, we're working with our mobile operator and others to see how that could be used as a tool to help increase awareness. But I think that's available to anybody, and I would encourage people to try and use tools like that, or just to include it in the training, but also do a lot more awareness raising about these features, and so I think there's just a role to kind of raise awareness, not just about accessibility features, but also just in general about this topic, because I think I feel, and I don't know what the other panelists feel, but I feel like we're starting to see a bit of a shift where there's a lot more, where there is an increased focus on it and recognition of the need to include persons with disabilities when thinking, and it's at the beginning of a journey. We have a long way to go, but it does seem, and I think COVID has also helped highlight just the importance of this as an issue. So I just think in general, I think there needs to be more awareness raising of the importance of this and the opportunity for addressing it, and just more sort of research done in this space. There's a huge lack of data, and you can't possibly know what actions to take if you don't have the information and data to support those actions. There's a massive lack of data on this topic. So I think investing in research and raising awareness, investing in sort of training and awareness programs, and I just think and just sort of pushing all stakeholders to kind of put this higher on their agenda and to think about it is just an important thing to do.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Claire. There's one more question I'd like to ask to Waragala, and then I'll hand it over to Tim to give us a brief overview of what was discussed today. So you did say earlier that our governments are at best clueless and they don't have accountability structures. So how do we motivate these policymakers, not just in government, but in the private sector, to adhere to and implement digital accessibility in policies and regulations?
I think we need to show them the numbers. For instance, it's been mentioned earlier that in many countries, a large percentage of the population is a person with disabilities, but also we need to show them that this population is largely left out in terms of access and use of technologies, and that the lack of accessibility obviously impacts a lot on their lives and livelihoods in areas like education, like employment, like political participation. So that obviously would necessitate a need to conduct a gap analysis to understand what the needs, the unmet needs of persons with disabilities are, because like Claire has just mentioned, if we do not know what the gap is, what persons with a particular type of disability are facing as a challenge, we are not going to be able to design useful solutions to those problems. But also governments, it is really simple. You have laws and regulations, enforce them. You can start that enforcement by making your own products and services accessible. A lot of e-services that governments are implementing, a lot of public educational programs, a lot of e-government services. Let governments start by making all of those and all public websites accessible, the standards which they have already put in place in some countries. Also, we need to make the case that governments need to promote affordable devices, affordable assistive devices and technologies, and the money is available in many of the countries. It would mostly be a matter of moving it and investing it in a better way in this sector. The other aspect which we need to do finally is making the case that in implementing the existing laws and policies, the private sector must do more. The private sector is not doing a lot of what it should be doing according to their obligations. So governments need to be hard on them, regulators need to be hard on them that they need to implement these things. But that is going to take a lot of actors from the different sectors, educating the government, helping to do research, presenting the evidence to say you need to act on this because it is a live problem which is denying so many people opportunities.
Well, maybe one day when we have a bit more time, we can talk about research. It seems to be a theme that keeps coming up, and questions about data collection. But Tim, I'd love to give you this opportunity to give us an overview of what you think the key points were from this discussion, and then we will wrap it up. Unfortunately, this is where our contributions come to an end. But Tim, you do have the last word. You're muted, unfortunately.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. I hope this works because you've probably seen me thinking, well, Tim, you haven't been concentrating enough. But with luck, you will see a screen of what I've been putting together. Okay, just anyone got thumbs up to show if it's there? Can you see it, Edith?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. So this is a summary of what you've all been saying, and I will share it afterwards. I'm not sure, Paul, if you can find a way of sharing it online, but we can zoom in. Here is our wonderful moderator, and in the middle, and this we have the result of the poll. And Irene
sorry to interrupt you. Right now we are just seeing your desktop, which is nice as well.
Sorry. Okay, let's get out. Sorry, it was meant to be seeing. Can you see a green?
Yeah, now it's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, here we have our wonderful Edith, who moderated and set us going. And we began, if we just go up here, with Ben making some great points about the work that GIZ for BMZ are doing, and really bringing in the key thing at the end there, the importance of universal design. And then Bernard commented on how far we can universal design increases digital accessibility and stimulate innovation. Maybe we should just make this a bit bigger as we look around. And came up with again emphasizing like accessibility, universal, sustainable impact. He brought in the SDGs. Bernard, we definitely need a comment about the SDGs. I made a mess of my first question, but then Edith kindly came back to it where I was talking about international development and cooperation. And then we had, Waragala giving a whole list of really important things. Governments are indifferent or clueless or both. I'm not sure if you want to go down forever having said that, but bringing, I think, the ideas around COVID. And Claire, Claire is, I put over here. We're talking about the great work that GSMA is doing, but emphasizing also that all stakeholders need to do more. And she mentioned the GSMA digital principles for mobile industry are going to be launched in December. And then, I don't know how everyone managed these questions, but we had a whole load of questions. What does tech investment look like, measuring success? And then I've logged the answers here as well as I can. I know we're short of time, but I hope you can see that that's the summary. I hope you can feel your voices were represented, and there will be this follow-up that everyone involved in this session can take away. Paul, I think you can put this, I'll send it, I'll clean it up, tidy it up. You can put it on the GIZ site. I'll put it on our UNESCO Chair and ICT4D site, so everybody can have access. Is that okay, Edith?
That's absolutely fantastic. Tim, thank you so much for putting that together. I have no idea how you were able to do that and still respond to some of the questions that were being posed to you. Truly, you're a man of many skills. So thank you to Tim, and obviously to all of the panelists who showed up today. I don't have anything to add because Tim has done a very good job of tying everything together for us. But my biggest takeaway was what Tim himself said, that our biggest responsibility is inclusion. Today, I asked you for concrete steps that we can take to do this, and I think we've heard about them, and now it's up to us. So thank you very much for attending this session, and from Nairobi, kwaheri.
Asante, thank you.
Truly great moderation there, Edith. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic job, yeah.
Thank you, Edith, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Claire.
Bye.
Thank you. An excellent panel, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.